Hello everyone, as always I'm Vlad Spara and I know things about shooting. In one of my recent videos about the HS9 pistol from HS product, I actually criticized its grip safety quite heavily. However, I received quite a few comments from some viewers who kept defending this grip safety, and I realized watching my video again that I didn't really explain very well why I don't actually like that grip safety. Regarding the HS9, there were even people wondering why this system isn't used on all other pistols. Well, there are good reasons. First of all, I want to separate two very important aspects, both of which I will talk about. In general, why I don't like grip safeties, and specifically why I don't like the one on the HS9, which, as you remember, has a very important feature. But we'll get to that. The first question we need to ask ourselves when analyzing this issue is, what are safeties for on firearms? And the answer to this question. Many shooters, even some of the more experienced ones, especially in the sports field, but not only there, don't know how to answer correctly. Is there a correct answer? I'm telling you, there definitely is. What are safeties not for? Safeties are not meant to prevent the user's stupidity. Safeties are meant to prevent the gun from firing due to a mechanical problem, in other words, when it falls or gets hit. For example, if there is no mechanical problem and safeties are meant to prevent mechanical problems, in other words, safeties are used to achieve this purpose. If you pull the trigger, the gun should fire, but if you don't pull the trigger, so in all other situations, mainly in practical terms, when the gun is bumped or dropped, at that moment the gun should not be allowed to fire. And that's the perspective from which they should be viewed and interpreted. There are various types of safeties. The most famous one is probably the manual safety, for example, on 1911 type pistols. We have this lever on the side that, when engaged, allows us to block the firing mechanism. Is the weapon safe like this? Well, there are various levels of safety because along with the manual safeties on firearms, there are also automatic safeties, the safeties. I use the plural. I like to think in these moments when we talk about safety, about firearms, of the so-called Swiss cheese model. If you've heard of the Swiss cheese model, you probably work in environments, in large organizations where there's a certain level of risk. Healthcare, firefighting, airplanes, so aviation. It's a model that explains how errors happen, how problems occur. I think it's also very useful for explaining firearm safeties. Imagine Swiss cheese with holes in it. It's a system that we put in place to prevent an accident, but the cheese has holes, meaning there are situations where that device might not work. But there are also many slices. I have many slices with many holes, but a problem has to get through all these slices and all these holes. To actually cause an accident, just like with weapons that have more safeties, we can say that if one doesn't work, the other helps. If on a Glock the safety on the trigger doesn't work, well then the one on the striker might work instead. If at least one of the three automatic safeties works, the gun, even in the case of a mechanical problem like a drop, won't fire. So the more safeties, the better. Don't follow this reasoning, because do you know what's better than a manual safety? Two manual safeties. So why don't we put two manual safeties on guns? Do you know what's even better? And in theory, on paper, it would make the gun even safer. Three manual safeties. And I assure you, you don't want to know what would make the gun even safer than three manual safeties. You understand that there's a design limit, but also an architectural one. And when I say architecture, I also mean how we think about using a firearm. There's really a limit to how many safeties I can actually put on it in practice. At a certain point, I'll have to find a balance between the practicality of use and the mechanical safety of the firearm. So in this context, keeping this in mind, let's take a closer look at grip safeties. You'll forgive me if I don't have an HS9 with me right now, also because it belonged to a friend of the channel and I used it to do my tests. I'll use, at least for the first part of the demonstration, so you can follow my reasoning, this Layama 1911 replica. So let's take a closer look at what grip safeties are, how they work, and why, in my opinion, they're not a good idea. What is a grip safety? The grip safety on a firearm is this device. We don't find them on all firearms, actually. I'd even say that only a minority of firearms use them. Grip safeties, specifically the grip safety, fall under the category of grip safeties, which aren't just on the back. For example, there are firearms that have a safety here on the front of the grip. What does it do? In practice, it does something very simple. I'll just show you that the firearm is unloaded. If I don't keep the grip safety pressed, and that's something that happens almost automatically when I hold the firearm. But if I don't keep it pressed, the firing system can't fire. If instead I hold it and thus deactivate it, then the firing system works perfectly. The idea of using a grip safety for firearms is almost as old as firearms themselves. It's no coincidence that we find it on many of John Moses Browning's designs, who was a pioneer of self-loading firearms. And honestly, back in 1911, it was a pretty effective safety. Remember that the number one enemy to defeat in these cases is the drop or the impact the weapon takes. It's hard to find another situation where a weapon with a round in the chamber can spontaneously fire without pulling the trigger. When these safeties are tested, almost exclusively, these weapons are dropped precisely to see what happens and if the safeties work. Well, if a safety deactivates the firing mechanism the moment I no longer hold it, so, while the weapon is falling, it's quite effective for this purpose. And you might ask me, so Vlad, why don't all weapons, even modern ones, use a grip safety? The grip safety has two big problems that have actually been solved. Or rather, you can have a safe weapon without having this problem nowadays. Pistols, especially handguns, it's a bit different for long guns, but handguns have an automatic safety. Almost always, it's the firing pin safety, which is by far the most effective method to prevent accidental discharges. It's extremely simple. It basically has no flaws, according to some, though that's very debatable. It could slightly increase the trigger pull weight. Honestly, in my opinion, it's total nonsense, but let's leave that discussion for now. Maybe I'll talk about it another time. Another group of people, on the other hand, say that striker safeties aren't necessary. Another very commonly used safety, which is very effective and hardly gets in the way, is the trigger safety. Some people always dislike trigger safeties, which I honestly don't get. And in the context of these safeties that are used today, the grip safety has exactly these two flaws. Flaw number one, it works perfectly when the gun falls because clearly I'm not holding it anymore. But what if the gun gets hit while I'm holding it in my hand? For example, during a struggle, it doesn't work. It's a safety that only activates if I'm not holding the gun, it doesn't work. Whereas, for example, the firing pin safety is always active. In fact, it only deactivates when I'm pulling the trigger. So the amount of time that this automatic safety, like the firing pin or trigger safety, is deactivated is only when I'm actually preparing. The gun, if it gets bumped or falls, is never active because I'm not pressing the trigger. The grip safety, on the other hand, is a safety that is only deactivated when you actually grip the gun. It's effective, I repeat, for falls, but much less effective in situations where there might be a struggle. And the weapon could hit something while still in the user's hand. The second reason, maybe even more important, is ergonomics. The back safeties are a bit uncomfortable, but that's the least of the problems. Honestly, you can put up with this discomfort. Some people don't even notice it. Well, I don't really understand the discomfort that the trigger safety can cause, but I totally get the discomfort that the grip safety can cause. Maybe it's just that I'm personally quite sensitive to the shape of the grip. Right at this point, where the tail is the so-called beaver tail, and therefore the height at which you grip the gun. I really like them very straight, but that's just my personal preference. The real problem is the adaptability of this type of grip to, for example, different back straps. If I have a modern semi-automatic pistol, like a Glock for example, or this is actually a Fender 509, I can in fact remove the back strap and put on others of different sizes, which ergonomically works wonders to adapt the weapon to the shooter's hand. I say this very often, for example, to those who come to shoot at the Legnano shooting range, and I discuss it a lot. Right in front of you, in front of a video camera, about how important ergonomics are and how well the hand fits the pistol. The back strap, the back, is one of the most important aspects, at least for me. And having a grip safety limits me, if not completely prevents me, from having interchangeable backstraps. Notice how all the most modern semi-automatic pistols have interchangeable backstraps. Having a grip safety doesn't limit me. It's not impossible because obviously it depends on how you think about it, where it is, where it's positioned, but it could potentially limit me because I have something here that needs to be in contact with the user's hand, which isn't the backstrap itself. Essentially, for these two reasons, I'm not saying that grip safeties are obsolete, but certainly in the context of when designing a firearm, thinking about the architecture of the weapon, it's not the most effective method we have to prevent an accidental discharge. It has its advantages, but it also has its obvious disadvantages to sum up. So personally, I don't like it because it bothers me on the grip. However, this is a purely subjective reason. The objective reason why I don't like grip safeties is because I believe there are much better systems for safety purposes, like striker safeties, trigger safeties, and then there's the fact that the grip safety is deactivated as soon as you grip it, which isn't exactly perfect. While those, for example, like the striker safety, deactivate when I'm pulling the trigger. In a way, it's much safer as a safety, if you know what I mean. So, I still need to explain why I specifically don't like the safety on the HS9, this safety on my i9-11S. It's true, it disconnects the firing system when I'm not pulling the trigger. But as you can see, the gun can cycle perfectly even if I'm not pressing the grip safety. The HS9 can't do that. I showed you in my video that the grip safety of the HS9, if not pressed due to how it's built, prevents the gun from cycling. The slide only starts to open, but then it can't continue. And if I already wasn't a fan of grip safeties for the reasons I mentioned earlier, this safety is a terrible idea. First of all, think back to the beginning when I told you what safeties are for, to prevent the gun from firing if the trigger isn't pulled. For what reason? A safety should prevent me from opening the bolt. What exactly am I achieving if I connect the grip safety to the inability to open the bolt? Some people said in the comments, that's right, it forces you to grip the gun correctly. Perfect, fantastic, it works great at the shooting range. If you're in a self-defense situation and your hands are injured, you can't get a grip. If you're in a less orthodox position, like on the ground, strange things happen. If you go study shootings and struggles of this kind, having a weapon that says you can't shoot, you didn't grip me perfectly, no, that's a problem. Weapons can't behave this way. We can't work around a tool that prevents us from functioning. Sometimes when clearing malfunctions. For example, if a casing is just stuck, I need to rotate the weapon and sometimes slightly break my grip to manipulate, for example, the slide or some jammed parts. This isn't always possible if I don't grip it correctly, as you saw in my video about the HS9. This maneuver can't always be performed easily because sometimes I need to move my hand to break this grip, to explain these concepts. I often really like to make comparisons with cars because cars are actually fairly complex machines, but more or less all of us use them. I'll give you two very practical examples of how you can fight against the car. Imagine an important device like the airbag, which only works if my seat is at the correct height. So if my seat isn't perfectly locked at the correct height, the airbag won't work. Well, but you should never drive with the seat reclined so far back, right? It's crazy to do that because this should deactivate itself. Imagine that this isn't right. For the car's central system, it needs to be set a little further back. I'm fighting against my vehicle and I'm disabling a safety mechanism that has other purposes, just because of a factor that's not very important. I should be properly positioned while driving, of course, but disabling a safety device. Just because I'm not sitting perfectly, it's a problem. Preventing a gun from cycling just because I'm not holding it perfectly is similarly a problem. I'll give you another example. Imagine a car. I'm running like crazy, my son is choking, I have to rush to the hospital, I can't turn the key. If everyone hasn't fastened their seatbelt properly first, maybe there's someone thrown in the back with their son who's choking. No. Even those in the back seat have to fasten their seatbelts properly. Everyone sitting upright before the car can start the engine. It's fine to reason that people in the car should or even must wear their seatbelts. But preventing a device from working, especially in emergency situations, if certain perfect conditions are not met, is a problem. I can't fight, in addition to my attacker. The automatic safeties of the weapon, when it's needed most, must work. By the way, this philosophy is also the reason why manual safeties are disappearing. Have you ever thought about why you hardly see manual safeties on modern pistols anymore? Because people, when they need to defend themselves with pistols, leave the safeties on. And in the same way, if I don't have a perfect grip on the pistol, I can't use it. I can't, in the case of normal grip safeties, pull the trigger, but I can't use the HS9. To load it, open the slide to fix the malfunction. Training and so on without there being any real advantage. Because no one has given me a convincing answer yet. Use the trigger, but I can't trigger. Use the trigger, I can't use the trigger, no. I can't say because that's how you hold it correctly. Great, fantastic as a teaching tool in the sense that you teach someone to shoot and hold it correctly. I don't approve, but I can understand how it might seem like an advantage for certain people. Here, the tool warns you that you're not using it correctly. Fantastic, but in a personal defense pistol, meaning a pistol that someone should use to kill in order not to be killed. In what way is it an advantage not to be able to open the slide if it's not perfectly gripped? It doesn't make sense. I hope this video has helped clarify a bit why I don't particularly like grip safeties. Certainly, at the beginning of the history of pistols and self-loading firearms, they were an absolutely effective method, and they still are, in preventing many of the problems that firearms can have. But as with everything, as with every small technical aspect, really of any device, we have to weigh the pros and cons. At this moment, with the technology we have, with the architecture of firearms that has had more than 100 years to evolve, the grip safety, well, in the best case, it doesn't bother you too much. In the worst case, like in the HS9, it could cost you your life. Because there's no reason why a pistol shouldn't be able to open the slide if it's not being gripped. I hope I've explained well enough this time what I think. Let me know in the comments. What do you think? That's all from me for today. As always, I'll see you next time.